Let's pull this up here. All right, why kindness is scary. I'm only going to put this on here momentarily here so that I'll be able to communicate with you a little bit better there. So hi, I am Melissa Vine, and I am grateful to share this space with you here today. I'm going to tell you about 3 of my biggest failures and how I got to the point where I could share them with you today without embarrassment. I want to empower you to face your own failures and to be able to sit with other people when they are dealing with theirs. So my first big failure was a failure of character. I couldn't stop judging people all the time. If they drove faster than me, they were unsafe. If they drove slower than me, they were annoying. If their house was smaller than mine, I judged them for not being as successful as my family. If their house was bigger than mine, I judged them for being consumerist. In all the situations, I was the standard. Judging happened so automatically, without a conscious decision to judge. I could judge you for what time your alarm went off in the morning, how well you treated a patient or taught a class, how much TV you watched, how much time you spent volunteering, how well behaved your children were, or how much money you had. Nothing was off limits. I would judge all the things, and sometimes out loud. I began writing about this failure of character in my journal. I wanted to change, but I didn't know how. Judging is just so easy. It's so automatic. We have all likely passed judgment on someone even since we entered this room today. But where does judgment come from? Well, we can only be as kind to ourselves as we are to others. Are you kind to yourself? So consider your self-talk, the voice in your head. Does it support you or does it judge you? Do you know where your self-talk comes from? So it began as the voice of your parents or caregivers from childhood. So I'm a therapist, remember, so you know we're going to talk about childhood today. So the way that your parents and caregivers talk to you, it became your inner voice, your self-talk. So your brain was literally being wired to create your self-concept based on the feedback that you got from those who had power over you. And much of it was wired by the time you were 5 years old. That self-concept was generated from those individual relationships, as well as from a greater social context that considered your social power according to your race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and other factors. So back to me being a failure of a person. I grew up in a home characterized by abuse and control and criticism, which made me feel ashamed, not good enough. Maybe you did too, or maybe you had a parent who was unavailable, either because they were lost in a struggle with addiction or too focused on their career or something other than you. Maybe you experienced the grief of losing your original family due to death, divorce, prison, abandonment, or adoption. Maybe you had a parent or sibling with mental illness or chronic pain or disability. Or maybe you don't even know what to call it, but something just didn't seem right. So maybe you too felt like you didn't have value growing up. So I became a perfectionist in order to gain some feeling of control when things were happening around me that I couldn't control, and also to create value for myself. I thought if I could be perfect, I would be worth something. But this perfectionism just fueled more negative self-talk. Because when I was winning at something, I felt better than other people and became infused with superiority. When I was losing, I felt less than other people. So in order to feel good, I had to stay elevated above as many people as possible, which is where the judgment comes in. So I must judge people if I'm functioning from a place of perfectionism. The system falls apart if I'm not judging. So you can't be a perfectionist without being a judgmental person. First, you judge yourself, and then you judge others. I can still remember in 2008 when I wrote a new word in my journal, humility. At the time, I honestly didn't even know what it meant, but I just knew I needed it. Over the course of that summer, I had 6 people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people who were close to me confront me about my propensity for judging others and how it had personally hurt them. The first couple confrontations felt like a fire in my chest, burning so hard that I wanted to fall through the floor. I was humiliated. That feeling is called shame. So remember, shame is what led me to be a perfectionist in the first place, because I thought I could overcome my feelings of shame and create value for myself through achievement. But I felt even more shame when I began to realize it wasn't working. Perfectionism will always land you in a place of failure. It's a losing game. And if my performance wasn't enough to prove myself worthy, then how could I have value as a person? I began to explore this. What if my value isn't this bar in the sky that I'm jumping to reach and looking around me to see how others are doing at reaching that bar? But what if instead it's the ground on which I'm planted? And that we are all planted on that same ground, giving all of us the same unchanging intrinsic value simply because we're human. So as my perspective shifted, the confrontations that happened that summer got easier. By the time I got to number 5 and number 6, it was almost like, okay, what do you got for me now? I was beginning to own my story and how I had treated others. This is how shame goes away. When you avoid it, like with perfectionism and performance or numbing out, avoiding, it just simmers down in there, fueling more futile efforts at proving yourself. But when shame rises to the surface, it's incredibly painful at first. You have felt that before, but it's actually the only way to overcome shame, by sitting in it. And failure is an excellent catalyst for bringing shame to the surface. Whenever you fail, you have to decide if you are going to own it, run away from it, or work harder to cover it up. So there I was, sitting with friends and family throughout the summer who were telling me that my character needed some help. And I finally started to get it. I thought I was craftily hiding my judgments, but clearly I was not. And I'm thankful to this day for that summer. As emotionally painful as it was, it began my long journey toward authentic living. As I learned how to not judge others, I learned how to not judge myself. And kindness is contagious. So when we start extending kindness toward others, we extend more of it to ourselves. And when we extend kindness to ourselves, it fills us up so that we have more kindness to give others. This healing process, it heals not just our own heart, but that of others. And of course, I still catch myself judging, but when I explore it, it can always be traced back to my own fears of inadequacy or superiority, and usually has very little to do with the person that I'm judging. So failure number 1 was a failure of character, and we're going to replace the question of how can I judge you with how can I support you? Now, my second biggest failure was a relationship, my marriage. Now, I use the word failure in a different sense here because I don't feel responsible for the failure of my marriage, but the marriage itself did fail. We met at a wedding at the age of 19. I had become friends with the bride the summer before. So when she asked me to sing for her wedding, I was honored. 2 weeks before the wedding, she called me. Melissa, I just heard I Will Be Here sung as a duet, and I loved it. Instead of singing it as a solo, would you be willing to sing it as a duet with my best friend's brother? Sure. Of course I would appease the bride. So there's this thing in Iowa called Iowa Nice, and it's pretty disingenuous, but we do it. And at that time, I was just grappling with this reality that rural Iowa likely could not produce a suitable tenor to sing with a college sophomore on a music scholarship, right? I wasn't even going to do my hair for the occasion. Okay, this was before my lesson in judging, okay? So back to my love story. So on July 28th, 2000, I stood at the front of a small town Iowa church preparing for the wedding rehearsal when he walked down the aisle. Our connection was electric from the start. And it turns out he actually could sing too. We talked incessantly until 4 o'clock in the morning and decided that night that we were going to get married. That is, once he broke up with his girlfriend. Less than a year later, we sang the same duet to each other at our own wedding. We were crazy about each other. I couldn't believe I had found someone so perfect. I wrote in my journal, "You are so wonderful. I just adore you. I can't even describe what I feel like when I'm with you." Very much young love, right? But why did we marry so quickly? I mean, he had just finished his first year of college and me my sophomore year. I'll back up a bit. So remember, I have an abusive father, and so all I knew was being controlled. So I had floundered when I got to college because I hadn't developed healthy autonomy or critical thinking skills. So when someone came along in my life who had rules about how a woman should behave, and they had stronger beliefs than me, I felt a sense of relief at knowing what was expected of me. The list of rules was long and arduous, but as someone who thrived on achieving, I delighted in the challenge. And remember, I was still this perfectionist at this time. So it was like, oh, more things that I can try to be perfect at. And so I became the most perfect wife and mom that I could, modeled after what my husband described and the books that his family gave me to read. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book called Created to Be His Helpmate. It's pretty popular in some very fundamentalist circles. If you are a wife, you were created to fill a need. And in that capacity, you are a good thing, a helper suited to the needs of a man. This is how God created you, and it is your purpose for existing. You are by nature equipped in every way to be your man's helper. You were created to make him complete, not to seek personal fulfillment parallel to him. I took this to heart. He didn't like how I sang or played piano, so I stopped making music. He wanted hot meals, clean laundry, conversations that centered on him, and the freedom to do and be whatever he wanted without accountability or feedback. I did it all with pride in an effort to become that perfect helper. I loved to impress and achieve, and these books and rules gave me outlets to do so. I gave birth to 4 boys within 5 years and was a stay-at-home homeschooling mom for 10 years. I was up at 5 a.m. to get to the gym before making a hot breakfast and packing his lunch. And then I stayed up late to help with our businesses after putting the kids to bed. But every time I met his expectations, he just raised them. I was never enough, and he was never wrong. Eventually, the emotional and physical fatigue broke me down, leaving only a shell of who I once was. In completing him, I had lost myself. Now, there are 2 general types of domestic violence. The one that people typically imagine, and maybe you've seen, especially in ERs, involves black eyes, lots of swearing, yelling, threatening. But there's another type that's a lot harder to identify. In fact, it can take years or even decades for victims to recognize it. And often they never do. They eventually leave their partner with a lot of confusing, painful feelings, or they get to the end of their life without really understanding what happened. This is a quiet form of abuse. It involves minimizing, invalidating, turning the tables, manipulating, silent treatment, selfishness, and apathy. The quiet, abusive partner in general just doesn't really care about their partner's needs or feelings or dreams. This is true of the loud abusive partner as well, but in those cases, it's reinforced with shoving, punching, screaming. With the quiet abusive partner, especially in the beginning stages, it's just hard to explain to someone or to understand yourself why it's problematic. You can just tell that something is off. And abusive partners often look like real gems to others. They can be charming, thoughtful, funny, successful, or even gentle. So it's difficult for an abuse victim to get the support and the courage that they need to get to a safe place. So we owned a garage door business. He worked long hours, and then he wanted to buy another business. This would give him extra income so he could hire a business manager. I liked this idea. Instead of our late nights of paperwork and collection calls, we could spend time together doing something more enjoyable, and I could start actually getting some sleep. But I had major hesitations about this particular business. It was a commercial cleaning company that operated overnight. And I imagined him working day and night, which is exactly what happened. Yet I kept telling myself that it would be worth it when we could hire a business manager. My therapist later called me the queen of denial, for the record. Well, one night, about 3 months after my fourth son was born, one of his employees could not clean the rec center as scheduled. And so my grandmother, who you saw in the picture I showed, was one of my favorite people, my favorite person in the whole world. And she was in hospice care with Alzheimer's, about to pass away at any moment. My husband pressured me into driving an hour away to clean toilets at a YMCA in the middle of the night, in between nursing sessions with our newborn. Our world centered around his needs. So these were sacrifices that I thought I was supposed to be cheerfully willing to make. My grandmother died the next day, and I missed it. And every once in a while, like this moment, I had a glimpse of clarity. I cried out to him that it wasn't fair that he put me in this position. I got the silent treatment for days since I dared to express my needs and hold him accountable for his behavior. I remember staring at my grandmother's casket alone, longing for comfort from my husband. We often had the most painful interactions when I was sick because it meant I had an unavoidable need. And I typically did everything I could to avoid having needs. Again, the perfectionism at play. But when I had 4 kids, 5 and under, and I couldn't stop throwing up, I asked for help. Could you please go and pick up lunch for us? He took one of our sons with him and returned 6 hours later with no lunch and a new canary yellow Corvette. He was distressed, both because I had a need and because I had hosted a get-together for international students from Drake University the night before. Why could you have a party yesterday and today you are sick? As I often did, I blamed myself. I should have canceled the party or not even had it in the first place. He doesn't like parties. He doesn't like interacting with people. I should have been more thoughtful. I should have had meals ready in the freezer for occasions like this. I'm a bad wife for inconveniencing him. And whenever he acted out, I would spiral more deeply into shaming self-talk. At the end of it, I would commit to do better. I would apologize for having needs and for being upset with him. I would dig deeper into perfectionism. How did you buy a Corvette after all? I asked. I used the money we were going to use for a business manager. I decided we don't need one right now. See, the phrase domestic violence sounds so serious, and it is, but it doesn't usually feel serious. Most of the time, it feels normal. You've probably had students or patients or friends who don't even realize they're in it, or when you hear them say certain things, you're thinking that sounds kind of off, but it feels very normal to them. It's just reassuring yourself again and again that he was right, so that you can believe that everything is okay. I wanted to stay in a place of denial and believe that I had the dream family I always wanted. I guess I did overreact. I guess I am just being needy. But domestic violence perpetrated by a quiet abuser is death by 1,000 paper cuts. There was no final blow, no last straw, just a series of moments in which I was invalidated, ignored, or objectified. I'm going to show you here the cycle of abuse. And I think this could be helpful when you're understanding it or experiencing it. So it involves wooing, tension, and acting out. So in the wooing stage, the abuser pours on affection and care, building trust, attachment, and love with the victim, or respect if it's in a professional environment. In the tension phase, the abuser begins to pull away. And then in the acting out phase, the acting out phase, the abuser further invalidates, dehumanizes, or sometimes becomes physically or sexually abusive. At this, so then the victim will often react and pull away, maybe even threaten to leave or to tell someone, which then causes the abuser to return to that wooing stage of the cycle. They promise to change, to do better, to read books, go to therapy, buy flowers, and then it begins again and again and again, and it's spiraling faster and deeper with each round until the victim cannot make sense of the relationship. Maybe you've experienced this with a partner, or maybe you've caused it. Maybe you recognize it in a relationship with a parent, a friend, a boss. Is there a relationship in your life that just feels bad or confusing? And have you ever asked yourself if it might have some characteristics of abuse? And if you start paying attention, you'll notice that 100 ways in which our society has programmed us to blame victims for being victims because it's psychologically more comfortable than holding perpetrators accountable. Not with just domestic violence, but with other types of oppression as well. Consider these commonly asked questions, but they're victim blaming. Things like, well, why didn't you just leave? Why did you run from the police? Why can't you just be the gender you were at birth? Why don't you just lose weight? Blaming is lazy. It's an avoidance of empathy and educating ourselves. So let's replace how can I blame you with how can I support you? What happened next led to my third big failure, a failed business. When I chose to divorce my abusive husband, I went from wealth to poverty literally overnight. So I had 4 boys, ages 4, 6, 8, and 9, no job. Remember, I'd been a stay-at-home mom for 10 years, no resume, almost no money, and I lost almost all of my friends because I wasn't following the rules against divorce in the religious circles that I was once in. I was very alone in a very dark hole. No one told me that getting out of domestic violence was more difficult than being in it. So I used to travel the world and eat out often, nice cars, big house, shopping whenever I wanted. Now the exciting purchase of the week was grocery store sushi because I could buy it using food stamps since it wasn't a hot prepared food. I felt very fancy every week getting my sushi. So my first job was at Hy-Vee for $8.50 an hour because I literally had to get a job overnight. And I just worked there for a couple months until I got a full-time job in the nonprofit sector. And then while I was working, I began getting my master's in mental health counseling. But we were barely getting by financially. And then the kid's dad stopped paying child support about a year after our divorce. And I could not afford to take him to court. So I decided to start a business on the side while working full-time as a therapist because I was growing tired of being poor. I will show you this business. So here's failure number 3, this business, Sunrise Bakery. There's one of those. Oh, I missed those cakes. So we lived at that time in the small town of Grinnell, Iowa. It's about an hour east of Des Moines. And I went to the Chamber of Commerce and I asked what the town needed. They had just finished focus groups around this issue and they indicated that a bakery was missing from downtown. So I traveled to nearby large cities, including Kansas City, to learn about this and gather ideas, take pictures, and I wanted to create the most amazing bakery I could. I hired a baker from the Ritz-Carlton in California. I got a grant from the city to restore a historic building with this perfect corner location downtown, and I opened a beautiful bakery with the best tasting cake I have ever eaten in my life. I didn't even think I liked cake until I tried Chef Taylor's cake. It was amazing. And crowds of people came pouring in on opening weekend. But many of them turned around and left, expressing anger, like literal anger at me that we failed to offer donuts. Huh? Having not lived in small town before, I didn't realize that small towns have their own sort of subculture, including definitions of words. So in Grinnell, the word bakery actually meant donut shop because they had had a bakery for 70 years there prior to my arrival in the town, and it sold homemade donuts and other fried foods. See, I didn't stop to ask the people in the town what their expectations of this bakery would be, which is one of several newbie mistakes that I made in this inaugural startup business venture. After a year of losing money each month, I sold the bakery at a loss to someone who had enough capital to remodel the space yet again and add the space for a fryer for the beloved donuts. And they're doing great to this day. I'm very happy for them. But for the 3rd time in my life, I felt that immense weight of shame. The boys and I had been living on a net average of about $1,500 a month for almost 2 years. And I felt like a complete loser. My 3 biggest fears and therefore my 3 biggest shame triggers were that the world would see me as incompetent, immature, and impulsive. This failed business venture poked at all 3 of those, and I found myself sitting in shame once again. I wanted to give up. I can even remember Googling how to talk yourself out of suicide, and I'm a therapist. The happy ending is coming. Hang in there with me. But first, I want to look at how these 3 failures came to be. I'm going to show you the Johari window, which you may have seen before. So you see this category in the top left, things that are known to self and known to others. Those are open things. Great category. If it's known to you, but others don't know it, it's a hidden category. And then in our top right, if it's known to others, but you're not aware of it, those are your blind spots. And then if you're not aware and others aren't aware, that's the unknown category. So with each of these failures, there were things that were known to others, but not known to me. So first I told you how I judged people. I thought I was doing a pretty good job as a human, but others believed differently when they pointed out how judgmental I was. Second, I told you about my failed marriage. I didn't understand domestic violence, but there were others who did and could see the problems in my marriage. I was just in denial for a really long time. And then third, I told you how my business failed. I thought I knew how to operate a business in the food industry, but there were others who knew that I didn't have enough experience. So we're going to zoom in on this blind spot category. So looking at the blind spots, and I'm going to show you what happens as we try to move something from that blind spot category to that open category. That's a really important transition for personal growth. Okay, so here's a graph that I've made to help us understand. So here I was in ignorant confidence, which is your blind spots. I thought I was a good person. I thought I was in a good relationship. I thought I could run a bakery, but my confidence lacked understanding of reality. So when reality hit, I had those moments of awakening where my eyes began to see reality and I crashed down into that shame place. Now, humans do everything they can to avoid the awakening and the shame that follows. It seems easier is just to stay in that place of ignorant confidence, believing that we have it all figured out, that we are in the right, others just don't get it. If they could just see the world the way I see the world. This is binary thinking, which is the earliest stage of moral development. In this stage, people are good or bad, actions are right or wrong. The world is a rigid place with very little ambiguity or uncertainty. This is what our brain defaults to because it's a way to categorize the endless amounts of information in the world around us. But it hurts us and it hurts others because we don't learn to understand each other or ourselves. We don't learn how to think critically. We cling tight to whatever rules and biases and stereotypes that we have received, and we're afraid to ask questions about any other reality. It's an avoidance of this wildly uncomfortable crash that comes after an awakening. For those of you who have allowed yourself to experience an awakening, you know what's next. At the bottom of the graph is the deep, dark place of shame, where you have lost nearly all confidence in yourself and whatever blind spot has just been revealed to you. This has been referred to as the dark night of the soul. As you heard in my stories, sometimes it's born out of your own choices and weaknesses, and sometimes it's born out of trauma that happens to you. It's important that you let yourself feel all the feelings when you are in this space. Grieving is an important process to the process of healing. There's no fixing this feeling. It just needs to be for a while. At some point, it will be important to reach out to someone who will be non-judgmental and see the good in you, even when you cannot. You don't have to sit alone in this space. For me, it was my best friend, Lisa. When I couldn't speak kindly to myself in those days, she did. She reframed what had happened. So for example, with the bakery, she said, Melissa, you were left in a position where you had to quickly figure out who you were, what you wanted to do with your life, what your skills are, and then build a career that would provide for yourself and 4 children, all while dealing with poverty and trauma. Her kindness was the fuel that I needed to move forward in courage. And let me make a quick distinction here between confidence and courage. Confidence is knowing that you can do something well because you have a history of doing it well. So I can get on a stage and speak with confidence because I've done it many times with some measure of success. However, if you asked me to get on a tennis court and play, I would have almost zero confidence. I have no history of success in tennis, and I have tried. But so let me encourage you to tweak your language a little bit if you're encouraging someone to be confident. Because here's what happens. If I go and tell a new student, or you as a student, if I tell you, okay, go treat your first patient, be confident, and then you walk in the door and you feel terrified instead of confident, then you feel like you have failed. But what if I tell you to have courage? Because courage is supposed to feel uncomfortable. So when you walk in and help that patient and feel uncomfortable, you will know that you have succeeded in acting with courage because you were supposed to feel uncomfortable, not comfortable like you would with confidence. And if you keep acting with courage as you face new patients, eventually you can build confidence because now you have a history of success in working with patients. So courage moves us towards greater self-awareness. So you see on the graph here, the courage, my self-awareness is increasing as I move to the right here. So ideally, of course, we want maximum confidence, maximum self-awareness. And we get there by having the crash, sitting in shame, receiving that kindness from ourselves and others, and then stepping forward in courage up that graph. It's helping you return to a more confident state. And I was armed with kindness from my social circles, and stepping forward in courage, I started another business. This one did become profitable. And eventually I became a fully licensed mental health counselor. So then I had enough money to move back to Des Moines. I could sell the part of my business that I didn't enjoy. And now today I'm the executive director at a nonprofit called The Beacon, where we work with women who are coming out of domestic violence, homelessness, incarceration, and substance use. It's growing very quickly. I have found my sweet spot. I love business, but I love it more when there's a passion behind it that I can get behind. And then also my speaking business has taken off in the past few years. A couple years ago, I received a full ride scholarship to Drake Law School because I was getting frustrated with the criminal justice system and how we were incarcerating women with low-level substance use offenses when they are just coming out of trauma and trying to cope. So I took the LSAT last minute and that went well. Next year, I'll graduate with my JD. My 4 boys are now teenagers. The oldest just became an adult last week. They're doing far better in life and character than I could have ever dreamed of on that day when I was so afraid for our future. We're happy. We love our home, our lives, each other, even our high energy dog. She can be a little much sometimes. I've established solid friendships with people that I can trust with all of who I am. And I absolutely love both of my jobs, helping women coming out of trauma, speaking to leaders like you, learning how to be a leader myself. Shame doesn't scare me so much anymore because I've sat in it. I've looked it in the face and I said, I'm here for this and I'm going to learn and grow in this space. I didn't get here because of success. I got here because of failure. That is the willingness to sit in those failures and learn hard things about myself and the world around me. There's no way that I could have shared my 3 major failures with you today if I was still functioning from a place of perfectionism. I would have felt too ashamed to let you see that part of me. I'm confident now about who I am and how I show up in the world, but it's a different kind of confidence. You saw at the end of the graph, as we climb with courage, we can get to a place of humble confidence. It's the confidence that has seen some things, that has done battle with the darkest parts of my soul. And it's the confidence that's not afraid to be wrong, to learn, to grow. What about you? Have you had an awakening yet? Did you run from it or sit in its shame? Do you have someone in your life that you can trust with all of who you are? You're in the medical profession. There are high expectations for you all. That can increase the amount of shame when we fail to meet those expectations. And we live in a culture that encourages people to push through pain, to ignore discomfort, to deny your needs and your feelings to keep others happy. To acknowledge your pain and your fears and your shame, to sit with them is the greatest act of kindness that you can give to yourself, but it is scary. The moment of awakening is scary. Kindness is even scarier. It requires softening a heart that has been guarded for so long to protect you from pain and shame. It requires letting others see the parts of yourself that you just want to hide. Kindness also gives you permission to forgive yourself. As Maya Angelou says, forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it. She's talking about blind spots. When you heard my title, Why Kindness is Scary, you might have thought I was going to talk about kindness toward others. And actually, it's first about being kind to yourself. That's step one. And have you realized that your self-talk is actually a conversation? It's as though there are two voices in your head, and one is you and one's kind of speaking at you. This is a conversation. And when there are two voices, we call that a relationship. And when those two voices begin to speak kindly to each other, they begin to speak kindly to others. And if you become radically kind to yourself, then it's easier to become radically kind to others. Imagine how your friendships, your families, your classrooms, your workplaces could be transformed by radical authenticity and kindness. But first, we must do the scary and kind work of sitting in our failure and our shame and owning our story, our whole story. Trust me, it will be worth it. Thank you for being here today, and I will take questions.
It's people on the call being shocked that I don't really have a question, but I have a number of comments, and I'm sorry that they some of them are personal. So I grew up in New York City. You may have guessed that from my occasional slip in accent. And it's not Iowa nice, it's Midwest nice. And it's been a struggle for me for almost 48 years at the University of Kansas Medical Center. Sometimes people just don't tell you. And I just want to know what do you need? And I can tell you whether I can help you. Yeah. Congratulations on the fraternity that you've raised largely by yourself. I think it's pretty incredible. Couple more things. I really appreciate your, I would say, inspirational presentation. But so I was trained as a scientist, and there are physicians, there are healthcare workers on the call. We're trained to be critical, and that judging part becomes really difficult to separate professional and personal life. I was married for 44 years. My wife would critique me and say, leave the, I would say, judgment, but leave the criticism at work. And it's very hard to do. I suspect others on the call have had the same sort of problem. But also in terms of courage, and it kind of crosses a line with the training of our healthcare workers, whether it be physicians, nurses, those in the School of Health Professions. Our biggest successes are when and it's a piece of kindness, is to understand their nervousness, first time a patient passes away, the difficulties involved in that, but treating our learners as junior members of our professions is a trick that, I don't know if it's a trick, but it is a strategy that works really, really, really well. And so hopefully there are some questions from others. I'm sorry that I made those statements without having a question in mind, but
I appreciate that insight very much. And I think too, when I first started doing therapy, I was a therapist for students at Grinnell College, which is a very prestigious school. It's right underneath Ivy League, and so the students really learn to be critical thinkers there. And I would say to them that you have to be careful that as you become a critical thinker, you don't become a critical person.
Yep.
And that's a really hard distinction, I think, to find, because when you start seeing things, you can tend to want to become cynical.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you for sharing those thoughts.
I'm going to open it up for Jenny to see the questions that are have come online.
Yes, if anyone has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or just unmute and ask. Melissa, just a lot of thank yous and notes about thank you for sharing your powerful lesson that you've shared with us today and your personal journey. Let's see, it says, just another comment, so important to honor both. I'm sorry, this one's a little confusing. You might want to look at this one, but not harming to self or others, so important to honor both. Okay, so it's just a comment on both of that. I did have a question come in via email. Here's one, let's read this. Shame is such a fascinating thing. I recently heard someone talk about shame as placing a judgment about good or bad on things, behaviors, characteristics that inherently have no good or bad weight. And that when we judge these things about ourselves as good or bad, we would never place those judgments on others. We give grace to our others so much easier than ourselves, which I think you kind of touched on that, which is very true.
Yeah. And I think distinguishing between guilt and shame, I think Brene Brown does a really good job of this in her work as a sociologist, that, you know, guilt is not a bad thing. Guilt can help us to see where we're off course, where we need to make something right. But oftentimes guilt and shame are married to each other. And so when we misstep, rather than just addressing the guilt part of it, we also attach shame to it. And so it's the difference between I did something bad and I am a bad person. And shame doesn't really help us grow. It moves us, like it puts us in a darker space. And so it's something the more we can work through, then we're able to separate guilt from shame. And I can say, oh, and that's why it's easier for me to talk about it now. I can say, oh, I screwed up there, or I could have treated that person differently, or I could have done that project differently. And I don't have to attach the shame, the heavy weight of shame to those actions.
I want to read this one that came in through email really quick. Throughout your journey of change with your personal life, did you identify any toxic relationships that you needed to change or get rid of in that journey?
Yeah, so I mean, most of my social circles were kind of marinating in shame and performance and perfectionism. And so a lot of it has been creating new social circles with folks that I feel safe with, to be myself, to be my authentic self. But even I think as we continue to grow as individuals, we raise the bar for our workplaces, our friendships, our partners, our social clubs, things we do in our free time. Like we keep raising the bar of like, hey, I love myself more now. I have more self-compassion, and I want to be in spaces where the people will respect me the way that I respect myself. And I think that there are lots of relationships that need to be explored in this process. Sometimes there are people you can't avoid, right? Like maybe it's your child, or maybe it's someone you have to, a coworker or something like that. And it's like, you've got to make this work. And so I use the analogy of a pool. Some people who trust too easily get to the pool. It's cold outside. They don't know if the water's cold or not. And they just go and just jump in the deep end. And then they're like, oh gosh, that was too cold. And then they're scrambling to get back out. That was me. I trusted too easily. And some folks don't ever get in the pool. They're like, I'm just going to go sit in this chair because the water might be cold and I don't trust anyone, right? And so there's this middle space where we trust slowly. And that's where you go to the zero entry part of the pool. And you put your toes in the water. And this is like your first meeting someone. Okay, what's your name? How are you? How's your day? And your conversations get progressively more authentic as you get deeper into that water. Maybe you start talking about feelings, or maybe you begin sharing a little bit more about your personal life. If you find that someone does not respond in a validating way to that, then you haven't already dove in the deep end and made yourself completely exposed and vulnerable to as much pain. You've just slowly gotten to the pool. So there are some people in my life that I'm like, you're okay being in my life, but I'm only going to go knee deep. I'm not going to share, I'm not going to get more authentic or vulnerable with you than knee deep. And that's as far as we will go. And then I've got those really important friendships where you're in the deep end and you can swim laps together and it is safe there. So yeah, good comments.
Thank you. All right, we have a couple of questions we'll try to get in. How can we help students and ourselves have grace, especially when burnout is such a driving force in our professions?
Yeah. I think the first thing we have to do is model it. So for example, I run a nonprofit. A lot of times nonprofit directors work way many more hours than they should. They're underpaid. But I model at work. I don't work more than 40 hours a week. Part of that is probably because I can't, since I'm also in law school full time and I also have the kids. But part of it is just, I want to model for them healthy boundaries and to not get burnt out. And I also increase the pay pretty significantly for our entire staff so that it removes that model of the overworked and underpaid nonprofit workers. So for me, first of all, if it's modeling it, I take that time off when I need it. My staff, we have unlimited time off. So if they come to me and say, I need a mental health day, I'm like, great, awesome, go do that. And so creating a space where there is not shame attached to performance or needing a break. But we have to model that ourselves as leaders. I can't say that to my staff, but not be living that out myself. And I think that's a really hard piece. And so much of it comes back to us tying our worth to our performance. Now, don't get me wrong. I still love to perform. Clearly, I mean, you know what I've been doing. Like, I love to perform. I love to achieve, but it's no longer tied to my value. And that's what makes the difference.
Thank you. How do we convey what you presented today to someone who doesn't want to consider it as helpful in learning versus being offensive?
Oh, that's a tough one. If you've never had an awakening, or if someone's never had an awakening, they're either completely blinded by shame and fear, or have sociopathic traits. So I would say there are folks that will never be able to acknowledge their blind spots. We know that folks who struggle with sociopathy, with narcissistic personality disorder, that many of those folks will never open their eyes. If you have someone like that in your life, it will cause you a lot of emotional pain and stress to keep trying to get them to see something that they're just not capable of seeing. And so then you just have to put boundaries in place. However, most people can eventually be more open to those blind spots. And I think just sometimes talking about your own journey. So like I just shared with you today, I'm hoping that you all sitting there are thinking more about your own journeys and feeling less afraid to share your own journeys of struggle, failure, weakness, because you heard me share mine out loud. And so it empowers other people to embrace their own story. And I think it is a long process. And for some people, it takes a certain event happening to them. And for some people, it takes having the right mentor come alongside them. And then some people just won't ever look at their blind spots. It's too psychologically painful.
Thank you. Dr. Teal says, thanks, Melissa, amazing talk. Could you talk a bit more about the concept of humility? I've recently heard some people describe it as a female characteristic and one that should be avoided rather than embraced. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's interesting. I have not heard that approach before. I guess it's not super surprising because it can be seen as a weakness, I think. So anything related to vulnerability, authenticity, humility, those can all be seen in a culture that's historically patriarchal and where men and power and control are the rule of the day. Anything that feels softer or gentler can be seen as a threat to that system of power that's in place. And so I think that, okay, I want to make sure I'm addressing the question. So I think a humility, it doesn't mean that you are making yourself less than others. I know that some people have that idea in their head, almost like this self-deprecation, and it's not that. I would say confident humility is this place of like, I can come to this space and feel confident in this space, but I also know that I still have blind spots and people will come to me with different perspectives. You all perceive this talk differently based on your own personalities and experiences. And I'm sure that many of you like heard things that you were like, oh, that's not how I would word it, or that's not how I think about that. And so I need to be open to that kind of feedback and understanding that I will never have arrived at this, perfect human place that everyone will be on the same page, right? And so I think of humility more in my mind is more of a strength because it takes a lot of emotional work to be able to display humility, vulnerability, authenticity. And so I see it as a superpower. And I think that's one of the values of bringing more women and non-binary folks into the workplace, is that we see more of those softer traits in the workplace. And if I didn't answer your question well, feel free to email me later.
Yeah, Christy makes a good point. Some of the strongest male leaders in our history have shown us their humility. Gandhi as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
Dr. Teal says, thank you. Any other questions out there for Melissa today? I guess I kind of have one. How do you teach this to your children? Is it the same message, or is it a little bit softer message for children? How did you do that with your children as you were going through this?
That's a great question. Again, I think it comes back to modeling. So we're so used to like power dynamics in our relationships. And I think of like boss to supervisor, or boss to employees, or supervising doctor to residents. Same thing with like parent child. If we can start having multi-directional accountability and authenticity, it goes such a long way in transforming our relationships. So yes, I hold my kids accountable for the behavior, but they're actually also allowed to hold me accountable. Same thing at work. If we have stated this is what my values are, or these are what our values are, and someone's not living in accordance with that, or maybe we're perceiving someone different than they intend, there's freedom to bring that up. So my kids are allowed to call me out on stuff, and they do, of course, respectfully most of the time. But they will call me out on things, and they will call each other out on things. But you're creating an environment where you're not associating accountability with shame. Because I can say something to someone who has less power than me, either my child or one of my employees, and I can lace it with shame so that they really feel what I want them to feel. And that's me leveraging my power to oppress. Or I can express accountability from a place of understanding. So for example, if a child is struggling with something, then I can say, hey, I noticed, this, and I want you to see how it might impact other people. And I can remember when I was struggling with that, and I did this to other people, and I found out that it hurt them. And so then I'm saying, hey, I'm right there with you in this battle for authentic and living with integrity. I'm not above you and telling you how to get here. Like, we're in the trenches together. And so just any ways that we can like kind of neutralize some of those power dynamics, I think helps kids to feel more safe to share.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think Dr. Klein has something to say there.
Yep, I think you've covered all the questions in the chat, and very appreciative of your time, Melissa. Sharing your story of leadership was an inspirational hour, and I really thank you for joining us today. I thank all of the audience. I guess I have one more question. So I stayed on so that you had somebody to talk to. Would you have rather had 60 faces looking at you? It's just something for future reference for next year as we go into the campus-wide leadership series, because our conductor, who was on our second speaker of the year, I think wanted that. And I just curious.
Oh yeah, I enjoy it because you get some energy coming back at you, right? If so, sometimes folks were nodding or eye contact. When I speak in a room, which is more common, you send energy out and the audience sends some energy back, right? Yep. And the Zoom's a little trickier. You all have experienced that. You have to work harder to get your energy through the screen, and you don't get quite as much back. And so it does feel more emotionally fatiguing. So I always appreciate any sort of reciprocal energy. So yeah, okay. But that would probably depend on the person. But for me, I like it.
Yeah, our hope is in next year's campus-wide leadership series will be in person for the most part, and hybrid when as we need. So
well, this is great. It kept people safe, and it probably made it easier for